So in the first part of this video series, we talked about the history of MIDI and kind of where it came from. Going back to the 1960s with Bob Moog, to the developments of the 1970s with the rise of digital instruments, and how these different companies overcame the problem of getting these instruments to communicate not only with each other, but to the brand spanking new development of technology at the time, the personal computer that came out way back in 1981. So the solution to this problem was developing this protocol, or this programming language that they called MIDI, the Musical Instrument Digital Interface, that allowed these different digital instruments to communicate not just with each other, but also with the computer. And oh, by the way, it wasn't that these examples I'm showing you here could actually communicate with each other, but it would be later iterations of the instrument as they developed the new MIDI interface and protocol. So we went over how MIDI is actually a very basic language, an old computer language that's based on it's limited to 128 messages or 128 values that it can send to the computer. And that ultimately the information that it sends to the computer is really very limited. It tells the computer which pitch or which sound we want it to play. It tells the computer when we struck the key, when we release the key, and also the force that we use to play the key as we sent that information to the computer. So once that gets to the computer and we get it into the DAW, then the DAW starts using all of its information to create sounds. So in this episode, we're now going to take a look at how the acoustic 88 key piano compares to the 128 key MIDI keyboard and the different MIDI controllers that we can use to enter this information into the computer. You can see here, this is the traditional 88 key acoustic piano. It has a range that goes from A-1 up to C7. Now I know sometimes people will label the keys on the piano a little differently, but the system we're going to use has middle C listed as C3, going down C2, C1, C0, that gets us down to A-1, and then it goes up to C7. So the range of our acoustic piano starts at A1 and goes 7 octaves up to C7. Now, let's compare that to the 128 key piano roll that we find in most DAWs. This actually goes from C-2 all the way up to G8. That gives us essentially about 9.5 octaves above what we get with the traditional acoustic piano. So just by comparison, here's the range of our 88 key piano going from A-1 up to C7. When you overlay that with the MIDI keyboard, you can see we get almost 2 octaves more on the bottom end and an octave and a fifth on the top end. Now, another common size that you can get a MIDI keyboard is the 61 key MIDI keyboard. Now, this size keyboard basically is going to give you a 5 octave range, C1 to C7. You can also get the 49 key MIDI keyboard, which is a 4 octave keyboard, C1 to C5. The 37 key MIDI keyboard, which is a 3 octave range, and the 25 key MIDI keyboard, which is, you guessed it, a range of 2 octaves. Now, as we look at that, you may be thinking, well, what good is a 2 octave keyboard going to do me when I have a 9.5 octave keyboard on our DAW piano roll? Well, I'm glad you asked. So if you look at this just 2 octave segment of the piano roll in a DAW, the thing that you're going to find with virtually all MIDI keyboards is that the MIDI keyboards are going to come with a key that is going to allow you to shift the octave of the keyboard. For example, here at the top, there's an 88 key Roland example. There's a Yamaha 61 key complete, I believe that's 49. The Keytar by Alesis over here, which is a 3 octave range, and the Akai MPK Mini on a 2 octave range. And every single one of those instruments has an octave shift buttons on them that allow you to shift the octave of the keyboard up and down along the MIDI keyboard. For example, you have this 25 key mini MIDI keyboard with a 2 octave range right now between C2 and C4. But if you wanted to work on notes lower than that, you use that octave shift key and that can shift it down. So now you're at a range from C1 to C3. You could go all the way to the bottom so that you're now at C2, so C minus 2 to C0, or you can go all the way to the other end where you're at C7 up to G8. Now, notice as I shifted up to C7, my keyboard over there is cut off, and that's going to be accurate. What you're going to find if you actually do shift the octave up that high is that you're going to create some keys on the upper end of that keyboard that aren't going to generate any sound. They're like dead keys. But the reason that happens is because the MIDI keyboard can't go beyond 128. So if you shift up that high, yeah, you're going to have some keys that are unused because the MIDI just simply can't send any more different signals out to the computer. We're accustomed to seeing our pianos kind of laid out this way so that the keys are sort of pointed to us. But as we work in the DAW, we have to get accustomed to this piano layout is going to be vertical on the left side of the piano roll. One of the other things that MIDI controllers and MIDI keyboards are going to give us the opportunity to do is not only shift octaves up and down the MIDI keyboard, but we can also shift by half steps or whole steps, which actually allow us to transpose up and down the instrument. So, for example, if we often teach students a C scale from C to C because it just uses the white keys. And when we start on C on a traditional keyboard, we get the arrangement of the major scale intervals: whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Now imagine if we could just take that same pattern of half steps and just shift it down like maybe a step. Well, if we could do that, now if we're starting on the note B, we could still now play a B major scale, even though we would still just be using the white keys and playing it as if it's a C scale. Now, with this illustration, it's kind of difficult to see. So let's take a look at what this will look like actually in the piano roll. Here's our piano roll, and I've added the notes of a C major scale so you could see what this looks like. And even as you look at this, you should be able to see the whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step arrangement. On the left side, the keys in blue are showing you what keys are being played. On my MIDI keyboard, if I just hit that transposition key, I can shift this down to say a half step. So now if you look at these green lines, you still have that same arrangement: whole step, half, whole, half. But I have that arrangement starting on the note B. So even though on your MIDI keyboard you're still playing a C major scale, it's now coming out as B major because we've just transposed it on our MIDI instrument. I could shift it another direction, and now we're in the key of F major. We could shift it down the other direction, and we can put it in the key of G major. With the students, you can teach them a single scale, C to C, and then that can be transposed into any other key that you might want to play in. Now, I always get this question, and early on when I first started teaching music technology, I actually thought it was a pretty legitimate question. You know, oh, well, all they have to learn is one scale, and, you know, that's not really learning how to be a musician. Like, you know, the only way that you could be a legitimate musician is if you can actually play all 12, you know, major and minor scales using the different key combinations on the keyboard. Or just like, you know, on our instruments with our applied professors, we had to learn, you know, how to play our major scales and minor scales. I mean, you know, musicians would never use something to make their instrument easier to play in different keys, now would we? Oh wait, except for, yeah, right. So here's the thing. Musicians, we've always used advancements in technology to make playing more efficient. Whether we're a trumpet player that's playing a B-flat trumpet or a C trumpet or a piccolo trumpet, or if we're playing a tenor saxophone versus a soprano saxophone. Nobody criticizes a soprano saxophone player by saying, well, you should be able to generate those pitches with your tenor sax. They created a different instrument. We have flutes that are in different keys, B-flat clarinets versus our A clarinets. So musicians, yeah, we've always used instruments that we could transpose into different keys to facilitate music making. So I think it's really kind of insincere, elitist, whatever you want to call it. But if we can do something that facilitates making music easier for our students, I don't know why we wouldn't do that, except it's just the principle of the whole thing, which I'm sorry, I just think it begins to be a waste of time. So use the tools that you have to teach your students how to make the music that they want to make. Again, I hope you like the video. Hope you subscribe. Hope you share this with your friends, and stay tuned, because when we come back, I'm going to share with you the 8x8 pad controller that a lot of people may know was developed to use with a DAW called Ableton. But I'm not an Ableton user. Not saying it's bad. Ableton's great. It just terrifies me a little bit. But what I've discovered is these 8x8 pad controllers, specifically the one designed by a company called Novation, and it's their Launchpad line of pad controllers, I think is a super, super flexible and great instrument to teach your students how to use it to create music. And there's a methodology to it, sort of just like learning how to play the clarinet. So I hope you return, come back. Again, this is Heath, www.mutechteachernet.com, the Music Technology Teacher Network.